Hi guys, today we're going to take a look at a stock plugin found in Pro Tools called the Bomb Factory 1176 compressor, otherwise known as the BF76. If you are a seasoned BF76 user or beginner, this video intends to cover both the basics of the plugin as well as some lesser known techniques for getting the most out of it and other versions of this popular compressor. The BF76 is at its most transparent when performing gain reduction of 4 decibels or less. This will serve to delicately rein in dynamics but still impart its signature tone. The tone of the BF76 is a subtle mid-range lift, which is present without performing any gain reduction, and is exaggerated the harder you push the unit. Probably the most obvious thing when looking at the controls of the BF76 is that just like its counterpart in the real world, it lacks any sort of visible control for the threshold. This is because the BF76 features a fixed threshold. So instead of a separate dial for this, we use the input knob to drive the audio up to the fixed threshold level, a bit like using clip gain to drive into the compressor, after which point we start to see some gain reduction happening. The output knob is essentially makeup gain after the compression has taken place. The idea being that once you set the level of compression happening, you then rebalance this using the output level. Typically, if you drive up the input for more compression, then you conversely turn down the output to compensate for any level changes or vice versa. The numbers on the attack and release knobs are not representative of any actual timing values as such, but rather an indication of the speed of these controls. 1 representing the slowest attack or release speed, 7 representing the fastest attack or release speed. The attack times in real terms vary between 5.7 milliseconds up to a fastest time of 0.4 milliseconds. The release times in real terms vary between 1.1 seconds up to the fastest time of 60 milliseconds. The ratio section is interesting for a number of reasons, but before we take a look at that, let's head over to the metering section of the unit. Here we have 4 buttons for metering. Off is for those who have a strong aversion to light, which, let's face it, is most engineers. Why would you want to turn off the metering section? Maybe you just want to use your ears rather than your eyes to make a decision. On the real hardware unit, the off switch does exactly what you'd expect it to do. The gain reduction shows how much compression is happening to the source, by far the most useful part of the metering section. From the most useful button to the 2 most confusing, the -18 and -24 buttons, which are meant to represent calibration points that correlate to a 1 kHz sine wave hitting 0 VU on the meter when sending the tone at -18 dB full scale and -24 dB full scale, respectively, according to the manual. However, with my particular setup, these readings correlate to anything but 0 VU, leaving me to conclude that these buttons have been included in the design to make the gain reduction button look just that little bit more important. Other interfaces may calibrate differently. Just as we are led to believe, each of these 4 buttons correspond to the ratio setting we would like to compress our audio at when it breaches the fixed threshold level. 4 will give moderate compression, 8 yields severe compression, 12 mild limiting, and 20 will give us hard limiting. It is perhaps a lesser known fact that as we increase the ratio setting on the BF76, just like its real-life hardware counterpart, the knee will also change from a gradual easing in to a much harder setting as we progress through to the highest 20:1 ratio. Now, most people will generally flick through the ratio settings until they find the sound they are after, and I must admit that before I knew any better, I tended to gravitate towards the sound of the lower ratios. The higher ratios didn't do much for the sound, or so I thought at the time. However, it all fell into place when I discovered that as you change to higher ratios, just as the knee changes, the threshold, which is still a fixed setting, also moves higher in small steps as you progress up to 20:1. In order to reach the threshold, you must then raise the input level to compensate. To compensate in the transition from 4 to 8, you'll need to increase the input by approximately 3.1 decibels. In the transition from 8 to 12, you'll need to increase the input by approximately 1.3 decibels. In the transition from 12 to 20, you'll need to increase the input by approximately 1.7 decibels. This is based on tests using a signal generator in peak mode generating a 1 kHz sine wave. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're trying to decide between 4:1 versus 20:1 and you're only just kissing the meters with a 4:1 ratio, then a threshold level difference of approximately 6.1 decibels between the two settings will certainly skew anyone's ability to make a solid judgment. In fact, in such a circumstance as this, 20:1 would most likely not induce any gain reduction until you increased the input level. So be sure to adjust the input accordingly to compensate for whichever ratio you decide upon. In addition to these ratio buttons, we have the hidden feature of the All Buttons mode, which is accessible by using Shift plus click on any one of the ratio buttons. Technically speaking, the sound of the BF76 in All Buttons mode is a replication of the hardware unit crapping out and misbehaving, and this owes itself to the fact that the BF76 compressor is based on a partially program-dependent compressor in the original hardware unit. That is to say that the ratio, attack, and release are influenced differently by different frequencies and amplitudes within the incoming signal to some degree, rather than responding predictably to a fixed frequency and amplitude range present within the signal. All Buttons mode confuses these internal workings of the unit to the point that this causes a fluctuation in the amount of compression performed over the incoming signal within an approximate range between 12.1 to 20:1 ratios. The knee also changes drastically and, as a result, makes the unit behave somewhat like an expander. The results of this mode over drums in particular are useful for lengthening notes and adding impact through the heavy distortion that the All Buttons mode exemplifies. Fluctuations in volume caused by heavier compression settings, such as that which results from the All Buttons mode, are most noticeable when the attack and release are set to their maximum speed of 7. This form of distortion is a great way of adding presence or aggression to almost any instrument and can be controlled by easing back the attack, release, ratio or input level to taste. Of course, alternatively, more aggressive approaches could perhaps lend themselves better to parallel treatment. The sidechain or key input section represents what would normally be referred to as the detector circuit in the original unit. The BF76 is based on feedback compression, which essentially means that the detection circuit is constantly sampling the level after the gain reduction has taken place, and then sending that information backwards through to the gain reduction circuit and adjusting it accordingly. So the BF76 sidechain input allows us to tell the compressor what to react to, which presents us with a few interesting possibilities. The obvious choice being that we can key the compressor from an external but different instrument. For example, a kick sent to the sidechain to duck out the bass guitar being compressed by the 1176. The way I see it though is that we have 4 different ways of using the sidechain. External instrument keys the compressor, send from the same track to the key, duplicate parallel sent to the key, no sidechain input. Of course, number 4 is included as an option as we always have the choice to not use something, and as it turns out, each of these 4 ways of using the BF76 yield different results. I encourage you to experiment with each of these options, but I am particularly interested in the last 3, and the parallel track opens up further subcategory options, as you will see. In this example, I am compressing a bass guitar. Here it is, dry, straight from the DI. On these following tracks, we have examples of the last 3 ways of using the sidechain. All of these compressors have the exact same settings, which are the BF76 default settings, with the exception of the ratio, which I have raised from 4 to 8. Now, they all offer something different in terms of compression, as is represented visually here. So we have here no sidechain input, same track feeding the sidechain, duplicate parallel track feeding the sidechain, and a modified duplicate parallel track. This modified parallel features a low cut with some makeup gain and has been shifted back in the timeline to be ahead of the original by 100 milliseconds. As you can see and hear, by not having a sidechain keying the gate, the compression is fairly brutal on the no-key input version. We lose quite a lot of the transient punch as a result, and the track itself is fairly flattened out like a freshly ironed shirt. With the track keying its own compressor, we have enhanced transients and what I would describe as a fairly musical sounding sustained decay release portion for each note played. The duplicate parallel keyed version features a consistent pancake-like flatness, as did the no-key input version, but with the exception that the transients are more enhanced than that of the track keying its own compressor. The last track features even less transient content than the first. The pre-delay, which causes the pre-compression, has made the BF76 act quite severely on the transients. However, still manages to retain a lot of the musicality of the track within the sustained decay release. This has resulted in a smooth, almost fretless sounding bass guitar. Having the last parallel track filtered of much of its low end has manipulated the BF76 into not reacting as harshly on lower frequencies in the signal as it would normally. Instead, it is reacting more to the bass guitar as a whole instrument rather than just the powerful sub and low end. So, as you can see, how you use the sidechain can really impact the sound, and none of these ways are right or wrong. It just comes down to which version sounds best in the song, how much transient punch you need, how flat, how dynamic, or how they affect the feel. Each of these has benefits individually as well as in parallel with the unprocessed bass guitar. But please don't take this one example as gospel, as the partially program dependent nature of the BF76 means that we need to make decisions on a case-by-case basis for each instrument. So hopefully that sheds some light on this plug-in emulation of this famous compressor, as well as opens up some new ways of using it. Be sure to experiment with every part of this plugin as much as possible to really understand what it does. Sure, it's free with Pro Tools, but that doesn't mean we can't have any fun with it. Until next time, happy mixing. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for new tutorials, or would like me to mix your music project, please email me at yamahadrums2009@hotmail.com, and please subscribe to remain informed of future video releases.